Free Japan channel. Today, September 19th, Tuesday here in Japan. Time is 11 a.m. in the morning, Tuesday morning, and autumn sky is extending to the horizon today, and the blue sky is so beautiful. And near the horizon, there are some clouds, white clouds. Autumn scene is extending. Dear listeners, how are you doing? I'm Matsumoto speaking. Number 5, FJC number 5. Today's theme is why did Japanese Navy attack Pearl Harbor? This is the topic of this morning. Japanese Navy had special air combat troops, and at that time, 1941, Japan had no air force. Japan had only navy and army, and each of them had air combat force. So the troops, the airplane that raided Pearl Harbor December 7th, 1941, belonged to the Japanese Navy. There was no Japanese Air Force at that time. So the attack to Pearl Harbor was decided by the seniors of Japanese Navy, and the supreme commander was Isoroku Yamamoto. Have you ever heard of this name? Admiral Yamamoto was the top leader of the Navy at that time, and he had so great an influence on Japanese Navy that his plan to attack Pearl Harbor was approved by the Navy office as well as Japanese government. So this attack on Pearl Harbor was virtually effectively the start of Japan-United States War, Pacific War. And today's topic, why did Japanese Navy attack Pearl Harbor? And of course, Pearl Harbor was and is the center or hub of US Navy in the Pacific region. So this is the most important place for US Navy to protect the mainland of the United States from the Pacific country, perhaps at the time from Japan. Admiral Yamamoto spent 5 years or so in the United States when he was sent to the United States. That was in the 1920s and 30s. So not consecutive 5 years, but separately 2 years once, 2 years twice, 1 year third, or in that way. So Yamamoto was or must have been familiar with the situation of the United States. The situation of the United States means the size of US industry and the scale of U.S. Navy, and and Yamamoto knew well that Japanese Navy couldn't defeat U.S. Navy because the industrial power was totally different. Perhaps the U.S. economic size or industrial power was at the time in the 1940s more than 10 times of that of Japan. Yamamoto knew it very well, and he was in the 1930s among the Navy officials who were against the war, Pacific War. So Yamamoto was opposed to the war between Japan and United States because he knew that this war couldn't be won. Japan couldn't win the war with the United States. So he tried to avoid the war as one of the Navy officials in the 1930s, so late 1930s. But contrary to his effort, Japanese government decided to start the war. Perhaps in September 1941, with the approval of Emperor. Then Yamamoto couldn't do anything, and what he could do at the time as the Supreme Admiral of Japan's Navy fleet was to lead the war favorably to Japan. And he came up with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Naturally, Yamamoto was thinking of this plan before the September, perhaps January or so in 1941, because even in the late 1930s, the hostility of the United States to Japan was evident. For example, President Roosevelt already delivered very hostile speech to Japan, even in the 30s. Perhaps it was 1937 maybe or so. And Japan had allied with Germany and Italy. So these three countries' allies were the decisive factor that the United States felt that Japan was enemy for the United States. So I think that this ally with Germany was decisive mistake for Japan or Japanese government at the time, 1940 September. And of course Yamamoto was opposed to this three countries ally, but this ally was approved by Japanese government as well as German government. So Japan was a friend of Hitler, so to speak, and it was very, very bad political decision of Japanese government. So I think that this is a dark history. This is one of the dark histories of Japan, of modern Japan. So Yamamoto had no choice but to attack Pearl Harbor because he knew that this Pearl Harbor was the hub of the United States Navy. So if Japanese fleet could carry airplanes, so divers and combat planes, and of course torpedo planes. At that time, Japanese planes were at the top level of the world, perhaps superior to that of the United States planes. 0 combat plane, and 99 diver, and 97 torpedo plane. These were at the top level, and Japan had carriers, 6 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, and Zuikaku, Shokaku. These 6 carriers. So Yamamoto decided to attack Pearl Harbor, concentrating these 6 carriers carrying hundreds of planes to Pearl Harbor. And as you know, the attack was on the morning of 7th December 1941, and it was before the declaration of war. So, U.S. Navy didn't prepare for the attack at all. And even the U.S. Marine soldiers thought, oh, today there will be some drill on a large scale. So practice seeing the swarm of Japanese planes in the sky. But actually, these planes started to drop bomb, torpedo, and attack the planes on the airfield of Hawaii airport. Then they realized that that was not drill, but actual air raid. So from this process, many Americans still say that this was a sneak attack without war declaration, and U.S. Navy was unprepared, totally unprepared, and Sunday morning, so sacred day of the week, Japan attacked the military facilities on Pearl Harbor, and many Marine soldiers were killed in this attack. More than 3,000 American young boys died or were killed by this attack, and the U.S. public opinion, which was very hesitant to participate in the Second World War, suddenly changed to remember Pearl Harbor, so to retaliate to Japan. And Franklin Roosevelt could declare the war against Japan and Germany after Pearl Harbor's attack. And the famous word of Roosevelt at the speech was, "The day, December 7th, 1941, would be remembered as the day of infamy." This is a very famous speech of Roosevelt. In the summer of 1941, so 4 months before the Pearl Harbor attack, U.S. stopped exporting oil and iron to Japan, and Japan relied United States on these materials, especially oil. was very important for Navy and Army, Japanese Navy and Army. So Japanese military officials thought that United States would stop the power of military operation of Japan, stopping the export of oil. So this was the biggest reason for Japanese government as well as military officials decided to fight against the United States. So if the United States had not decided to stop the export of oil and iron to Japan in August 1941, then the war or Pearl Harbor attack wouldn't have happened, at least in December 1941. And 1941 December was, in the European continent, severe, harsh battle between Soviet Union and Germany. Moscow battle was going on, and German army couldn't win the battle 1941 December. And 1942 again Germany attacked Russian territories, especially the Battle of Stalingrad is very famous in historical point of view. And in the Battle of Stalingrad, Germany couldn't defeat Soviet Union army either. So, in this viewpoint, if the United States hadn't stopped the export of oil to Japan, then Japan wouldn't have started Pearl Harbor attack, and in half a year or in 1 year, the process of European battle would have been clear. Clear means German was on the losing side. German was disadvantaged. So Japanese leaders, military officials and politicians thought better of starting the war against United States, and they thought, oh, let's wait until the military situation would be clear in the European continent. Then, as you know, Germany was defeated, and the Red Army went on and on. 1943, 1944, then the defeat of Hitler Germany was obvious to everyone. So Japan should have waited at least 1 more year. Oil was still there in Japan 1 more year. Then the European continent military situation was very unfavorable for Germany, so the ally of Japan at that time. And then the Soviet Union was on the dominant side. Then Churchill in England, Churchill in the British, and Roosevelt, or not Roosevelt, but the leading politicians of the United States would have started to be alert against the Red Soviet Union because they hated communism from the first time. Of course, President Roosevelt is now said to have been a kind of socialist, and his subordinates were also communists. But these were few in the American politicians. Most of the American politicians were capitalists, of course, and didn't they didn't want to be on the side of communist Soviet Union, of course. So the attitude of the United States to Soviet Union would have been changed if Japan had waited 1 or 2 more years. So this is the secret of history, in my opinion, about the Pacific War. Today I talked about the start of Pacific War between Japan and the United States. I think that this war was a very miserable for Japanese people as well as Japanese government. And Japanese history was very distorted by this war, by the defeat of this war. So I always think that Japan shouldn't have started Pearl Harbor. Thank you very much.